Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Shannon Clifford, and I am the Executive Director of the Mesa Verde Foundation, which is a 501c3 charitable organization and a philanthropic partner to Mesa Verde National Park. It is wonderful to welcome you back to the webinar series after our summer break. We hope that you all had a great summer. We are very excited to kick off Conversations from the Mesa fall season with guest presenters Kristy, Sholly, and Amy Ireland, who are going to speak about the more inclusive story and how they're creating new interpretive media at Mesa Verde National Park, and discuss how Mesa Verde was the first national park established to preserve the rich cultural legacy of ancestral peoples. For much of the park's history, sites and cultural items were interpreted through the lens of archaeologists and historians. Now the park's interpretive staff is working to tell a more complete story that includes perspectives of the Pueblos and tribes with close ties to these lands. Today's interpretive media highlights how multiple ways of knowing, including Western and Indigenous science and oral traditions, complement each other to provide a deeper and richer understanding of this sacred landscape. Thank you all for joining us to learn more about this important work. Now, I have the honor of formally introducing our presenters for today's webinar. Kristy Sholly is the Chief of Interpretation and Visitor Services for Mesa Verde National Park. She has been an interpretive park ranger for over 25 years, sharing her love of our nation's natural and cultural heritage in 10 national parks, including Arches, Canyonlands, Death Valley, Glacier, Grand Canyon, Kenai Fjords, Mojave, Olympic, and Zion. Kristy's expertise includes team building and collaborating with partners in the development of exhibits, films, and interpretive media. Amy Ireland is a visual information specialist for Mesa Verde National Park. Over her 30-plus years with the National Park Service, Amy has held a variety of positions, most recently serving as the project manager, interpretive planner, and writer on a wide range of interpretive media projects, including exhibits, films, and publications. Kristy and Amy, I want to thank you for sharing your insights with us. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Shannon, and thanks to Mesa Verde Foundation for having us today. We're excited that you're all joining us. My name is Kristy Sholly, and it's an honor to serve as the Chief of Interpretation and Visitor Services for Mesa Verde National Park. For the next 35 minutes, Amy Ireland and I will be taking the time to introduce ourselves and talk about why telling a more inclusive story is meaningful to us and how it enhances the experience for all park visitors. We'll provide examples of how we, Interpretation at Mesa Verde, have been interpreting the cultural history of the park and the opportunities we have by co-creating exhibits with others to tell a more complete story, with the museum exhibit redesign as the primary example. And we'll talk about what to look for if you want to learn more, support, or visit Mesa Verde. Both Amy and I have different journeys in finding our personal connection and purpose at Mesa Verde, but each brought us to a similar place where we find meaning in the work that we do here. Prior to moving to Mesa Verde in June of 2016, I was fortunate to live and work in what I believe to be among the most beautiful national parks, from Alaska to parks nearby on the Colorado Plateau. What all the parks I've worked for had in common is that they were all stunning geologic parks. Kenai Fjords National Park, where I worked most recently, was one of the parks that was established under ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act of 1980. It was a newer park, and I enjoyed building interpretive media and an interpretive program there. My initial thoughts in transitioning to Mesa Verde were, since the park was created in 1906, 10 years before the National Park Service was established in 1916, it would have everything in interpretation all figured out. And it did, on many accounts. There was a new long-range interpretive plan that communicated a vision for the future of interpretation. The Visitor and Research Center had just been built in 2012 with exhibits that included tribal input. Our seasonal training brought in tribal elders to learn more about the park's associated tribes and Pueblos. And the park had a long-standing history of cultural demonstrations. But I was surprised by the aging exhibits in the park's museum and the absence of Indigenous perspective in our film and on our staff. At this point, Spruce Tree House was closed due to the rockfall in October of 2015. So the lack of physical accessibility to our ancestral sites, because Spruce Tree House was the only easy to access site, and within our historic museum was very noticeable. So the projects I focused on in my first 2 years were about inclusion in more of a physical sense. Projects like the museum ramps, virtual tours, and distance learning to make Mesa Verde more accessible physically and virtually so that people could visit regardless of their physical or socioeconomic challenges. Some of the first interpretive media projects, like the Mesa Verde Voices podcast series, Waysides, Trail Guides, and Mesa Top Loop audio tour, were about the inclusion of Indigenous perspective, and I'll highlight some of them briefly in just a bit. The project that had the biggest impact early on in my journey at Mesa Verde was the Mesa Top Loop audio tour. For those of you who have not had the opportunity to experience it, there's a giant QR code right there for you to link to it. It's a 43-minute podcast that you can listen to anywhere, but it's meant to complement the experience of driving the 6-mile Mesa Top Loop Road within the park. It is narrated by TJ Atsey, who is a park ranger from Laguna Pueblo and a direct descendant of the ancestral Pueblo people. We found we had a professional voice talent on our staff, and she did an amazing job. After we were finished recording parts of the audio tour, TJ, in the most heartfelt and meaningful way, thanked me for allowing her to honor her ancestors by sharing their stories. It was a painful reality to hear that a person with an ancestral connection to this place was thankful for being allowed to honor their family and share their stories. I realized in that moment that empowering the inclusion of Indigenous perspective in the interpretation of this sacred landscape needed to be a focus for my work at Mesa Verde. And that has become my purpose statement and focus of my work for the last 5 years.
My name is Amy Ireland, and I am a visual information specialist at Mesa Verde. My main role in the park is managing interpretive media projects like the new park film and the new museum exhibits. I started my career as a seasonal interpreter at Mesa Verde back in 1989. And I'd only been on the job for a short while when an older man approached me while I was working in Step House, and he asked me, who were these people? So I started to share with him what I learned in my 2 weeks of seasonal training, but he stopped me almost immediately. And he told me that he was Hopi and that these people were his ancestors. And he went on to speak for some time about his connection to this place. Now, I was a young, brand new park ranger, and I was excited to interact with visitors and help them gain a better perspective and appreciation of the park. But in this instance, I felt like I had failed. It was clear that this visitor was disappointed with me and with what I had to share. And when I thought about that experience over the years, I tried to imagine how I would feel if I visited a site that was sacred to me and important to my heritage. And I found an interpreter who not only wasn't from my culture, but shared a narrative that left out my connection to that place. I think it would have left me feeling unrepresented and unwelcome. When I came back to work at Mesa Verde some 30 years later, I heard many similar stories. While working on the 3 short resource films, Peter Pino, a Zia elder and former board member of Mesa Verde Foundation, relayed how he had visited the park as a teenager. And the ranger on his cliff dwelling tour said something to the effect that we don't know where these people went. And he was there thinking, well, I'm right here. As part of the content development process for the new museum exhibits, we worked with a native facilitator who told us he had visited the museum with his family, and he felt so unwelcome that he didn't plan to return to the park. As stewards of these public lands, at the very least, we should be making our visitors feel welcome. And the fact that visitors with such a deep connection to this place were having the opposite experience was deeply concerning to me.
And so we started to take a hard look at what might be unwelcoming and having conversations about those things and about what the narrative at Mesa Verde should look like in the future. In the Mesa Top Loop audio tour, TJ says, we as Pueblo people understand how much stories matter. When people are written out of their histories, they are rendered powerless. We believe that people can learn from our history, our successes, as well as our mistakes and failures. In mainstream media, there's still so many headlines that speak to the lost civilization at Mesa Verde and dramatize the disappearance of the people. Many of our visitors come to the park with this idea and ask about the abandonment or the lost civilization of Mesa Verde. This idea, as TJ said, writes Indigenous people out of their history and disconnects modern tribal communities from their ancestral homelands. This is not only damaging to communities, but it's a disservice to park visitors that miss out on learning about the rich cultures that came from Mesa Verde. Early archaeologists recognized connections between ancestral Pueblo people and present-day Pueblo communities. Yet over the years, many visitors to Mesa Verde still came away with a story about a people who mysteriously vanished. Even if our current interpretive media doesn't specifically promote this idea, many of our older park publications and exhibits don't seem to do enough to correct this misunderstanding. Shortly after I started working for the park, a friend who was new to the Southwest came to visit. After thoroughly exploring and reading every exhibit in the museum, he asked, "So where did the people go?" And it was shocking to realize that our museum exhibits still do not address this very basic information. In many cases, ancestral people and even modern Indigenous people are talked about in the past tense, as if they were part of the history here, but no longer remain. 8 years ago, I may not have noticed the language on the park's map, but because of our conversations with tribal members and our learning journey, some of the following lines of text really jump out, and every day we're still learning. Here's one of them as an example. In the late 1200s, in the span of a generation or two, they left their homes and moved away. There is no reference anywhere else on the map to where they may have gone. The park map text also states, despite decades of excavation, analysis, classification, and comparison, our knowledge is incomplete. This doesn't seem to recognize the role of oral history, native science, and traditional knowledge. In the past, most of our interpretation relied on the chronological division of culture based on changes in architecture, pottery, and cultural remains. While this is an important tool for archaeologists, it's a very Western view that is considered offensive to some tribal members, as it does not reflect the way they think about their time or their ancestors' lifeways. And this is just an example of a current exhibit we have in the park with the timeline on the bottom part of that. In 2019, Mesa Verde hosted a youth summit, and we used this as an opportunity to get a sense of what a group of young people thought about the current museum exhibits, what they liked, and what they would like to see and learn about in future exhibits. One of the students noted that it felt like the exhibits put ancestral people and their items in cases alongside cases of rocks, trees, and taxidermy birds. It felt like the people were being treated like specimens to be observed. It's not surprising that Indigenous people have felt erased and othered. It is the responsibility and interpretation to revise this narrative and ensure that Indigenous people have a voice in how their sacred lands are interpreted. In revising the park map, we will address the presence of modern Pueblos and tribes. Space will be provided for quotes that express their connection to place. There's a section about how to visit sacred sites with respect, and while the story includes Indigenous perspective, it still includes what we know about Mesa Verde from the 100+ years of archaeological work that has been done at the park. And this is the old unigrid contrasted with the newer plan for the unigrid, and you can kind of see a little bit more of the modern Pueblos there. As we replace and update waysides and publications, we also use the opportunity to pay close attention to their content and make sure that we are incorporating Indigenous perspective and using language that is more culturally appropriate and inclusive. Some of the most powerful and meaningful connections for visitors can happen when visitors have the opportunity to hear directly from tribal community members. And some of those efforts include our continued offering of cultural demonstrations and dances. In recent years, we've been excited to develop a relationship with the Ute Mountain Utes Red Sky Drum Group, and visitors have been enjoying their dances at the Moorfield Campground Amphitheater. We were also excited to be able to offer dances at the Chapin Mesa Amphitheater this year. The Loma Yestoa family from Hopi were the first group to dance in the plaza in nearly a decade. We also hosted traditional fetish carvers, pottery demonstrations, and weaving demonstrations this past summer. Mesa Verde Voices podcast is a collaboration between KSJD Public Radio, Mesa Verde Association, and the park that was created back in 2017. Its purpose is to connect the experience of ancestral Pueblo people from the Mesa Verde region, people today, and includes interviews with tribal community members with strong connections to the area. Over its 5 seasons, we've explored everything from archaeoastronomy in the most recent season, trade, cultural preservation ethics, and my favorite episode, Two Spirits. The Indigenous Ranger Intern Program hosted 4 interns this year, funded by a National Park Foundation Inclusive Storytelling Grant. The park is working with the Ancestral Public Lands Intern Program for recruitment and support, and the interns receive educational awards based on their service. One of the greatest highlights of this summer was seeing these young men make meaningful connections with ancestral sites and the connections they made with visitors. 2 of our interns returned to college in August, and the other 2 will remain at the park to assist with fall education programs. We look forward to having them all back at the park next summer. The most intensive effort to address the inclusion of Indigenous perspective is the redesign of exhibits in the Mesa Verde Museum, which is located 22 miles inside the park from the entrance. I want to take a few minutes to explain why we're putting a lot of effort into the redesign, and then Amy will share where we are in the process, and we'll do a quick walkthrough of the current exhibit plan. The museum, where the exhibit redesign is taking place, is one of the oldest in the national park system. Its purpose when it was built in the 1920s was to display cultural items from the many excavations that happened in the late 1800s and early history of the park, which is in the early 1900s. Since the museum opened nearly 100 years ago, the exhibits have been minimally changed, and the redesign is needed to address the absence of tribal perspective. The current exhibits tell the story of ancestral Pueblo people from the perspective of 1920s archaeologists without any input from tribal community members. We also want to address some of the physical and programmatic accessibility issues. In 2024, the museum will be fully physically accessible for the first time in its history. This is due in part to the efforts of the Mesa Verde Foundation to acquire grant funding through the Christopher and Dana Reeves Foundation for the construction of 2 of the 5 ramps in the museum. This is critically important to be able to provide an inclusive experience for all visitors. Exhibits and text labels will also be designed using universal design principles so that people of all abilities and multiple learning styles will be able to interact and learn about the cultural and natural heritage of the park. We also have the opportunity to address some of the inaccuracies and tell a cohesive story. There are opportunities to interpret how our understanding of ancestral Pueblo culture and the natural history of the area has changed over time based on oral history and current scientific research, and organize the information in a logical, audience-centered, and cohesive way. And lastly, we want to make sure that we're honoring the cultural items by displaying them in a context so they can better tell their stories. Before we even started this project, we knew we were going to need some input from our associated tribes and Pueblos. And in 2018, we began our collaboration with the Museum and Field Studies at University of Colorado Boulder. We knew that they had the experience in tribal collaboration, and this project allowed us to work with the expertise of their students, staff, and faculty. In 2018 and 2019, we began the conversation at the tribal consultation meetings that were held in Mesa Verde National Park and in Farmington, New Mexico. One of the keys to the success of our tribal engagement process was the work of our graduate interns in 2019. They visited tribal government officials and museum professionals in the Four Corners region to talk with them about how they'd like to be engaged with the exhibit process. This was a good step forward in developing relationships and trust. Out of that came the creation of a design reference guide to tribes and Pueblos, and we received their feedback suggesting a large in-person meeting in Albuquerque, which was held at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in January of 2000. The meeting brought together ideas about what topics should be covered, and most importantly, through an executive session, formed the Native Interpretation Working Group to represent the larger group. This group of 8 tribal community members consists of 6 members from the Pueblo communities, a member from the Navajo Nation, and 1 member of the Ute Tribal Nation. The Albuquerque meeting was followed by archeology workshops at CU Boulder and Fort Lewis College. And in addition to the Native Interpretation Working Group, content working groups were formed for archeology, which includes Native archaeologists, natural resources, and history. These groups worked together over 2 years to develop an in-depth content package to inform the project. The goal of this project is to bring all voices into the room, all ways of knowing, to create a richer, deeper understanding of place. I think it's worth emphasizing to everyone that when we include Indigenous perspective, it is not to the exclusion of all other voices. It is to broaden the narrative to include a perspective that has been absent and missed in the current exhibits, and until recently, the park film.
So during this time, the Mesa Verde Foundation received a grant from the Colorado State Historical Fund to replace our 20-year-old park film. The Native Interpretation Working Group was asked if they would assist, and they agreed to serve as advisors, but they recommended that we bring on a Native producer to work on this project. And we did this realizing that it was not only important to have Indigenous speakers in the film, but also to have that kind of guidance behind the camera. The new film focuses on sharing the park's significance from the Indigenous perspective, and you can view it from the park website, or you can access it using the QR code on the screen here. And the film does fill a very important niche, but the new exhibits are going to allow us to tell a broader story. So every aspect of the current design plans that I'm about to share with you were shaped by collaboration with the Native Interpretation Working Group and other stakeholders. And it really has been a journey, and it continues to be a learning experience every step of the way. Working with our tribal partners has also helped me become a better listener, something I'm still working on. And as someone who tends to think out loud and be quick to jump in with ideas and comments, I've had to learn to slow down, be comfortable with longer pauses, and give people more space. It's also taught me the value of setting aside any preconceived notions that I might have had about how best to interpret the stories of Mesa Verde, and be aware that I, understandably, come at things from a Western perspective and be open to hearing that from our partners. Probably one of the earliest examples of this related to the historic dioramas. Early in the project, I fully expected that we would continue to display them with some new signage or something to address some of the inaccuracies and the other concerns we'd heard about them. But during the content development phase, it became clear that despite the fact that they were loved by many, they were deeply problematic for many tribal community members, and they contributed to that sense of there not being welcome in the space. The Native Interpretation Working Group provided us with a detailed report that stated, "We have come to believe that keeping the dioramas would have negative implications for the future of the collaboration, and conversely, that confirming they will not be in the redesign would create a stronger foundation of trust and continue the positive direction of the partnership we have cultivated to date." Casey Cook Collins, who had just become the park superintendent at that time, had a close personal connection to the dioramas as her grandfather helped design and fabricate one of them. But after considering the report from the Native Interpretation Working Group, she fully supported the decision to have them permanently taken off display. Kristy has said more than once in this process that we need to move at the speed of trust. And although this was a particularly difficult decision, we ultimately felt that building this trust outweighed the value of holding on to any one particular exhibit element. And this is just one example of the difficult conversations we've had and no doubt will continue to have as we move forward with this design process. When we were working on the new park film, the filmmakers remarked at one point that they're used to having a single client, not 26 different tribes with, in some cases, very different perspectives. But we are committed to doing our best to find a way to include these different perspectives, even when they don't always align with each other. We're not going to tell a sanitized story that implies that all tribal communities are the same. Instead, we want to celebrate that diversity as best we can in the space available. The Native Interpretation Working Group have been incredible partners. If you visit other park areas, you'll see many of the same names and faces in their exhibit materials. This group, they all have day jobs, and other projects, parks, and agencies are clamoring for their time and input. We are by far not the only ones who are trying to tell more inclusive stories today. And managing this project is my primary job at Mesa Verde, but it's not everyone else's highest priority. And so we've had to be patient and do our best to work around competing schedules and limited availability. This has meant longer comment periods, working around various feast days, festivals, and other commitments, and trying to have meetings in other places like Albuquerque that's more convenient for many of our tribal partners. Upgrading a 100-year-old museum is both exciting and daunting, and bringing together diverse perspectives and finding a path forward takes time. But we're already starting to see the positive impact of this approach. Just as the Native Interpretation Working Group appreciated the inclusion of a Native film producer, tribal leaders have made it clear that they very much appreciate the input and guidance we've received from the Native Interpretation Working Group. We recently completed formal tribal consultation for this phase of the exhibit design, and it felt like there was a lot more trust in the process since we co-created this with representatives that the tribes had selected, rather than presenting something for review that had lacked that kind of input. And it truly has been an honor and an inspiration to work with the Native Interpretation Working Group. They've shared personal stories of their own ties to Mesa Verde and their experiences of having stories and traditions passed down to them from their grandparents and other elders, and their connections to items in the park collection, cooking stones and other items that are similar to ones that they have and use and treasure. These experiences are so powerful and they enhance my own appreciation, and I'm really excited to share those types of narratives with park visitors. So one of the first parts of planning new exhibits is developing an overall big idea that helps frame the exhibit content. The big idea for the new exhibits that came out of the content development process is that Mesa Verde is a story of people in an ongoing relationship with the landscape. And although a lot of the museum content will still interpret the lifeways of the ancestral people who built the mesa top and cliff dwellings, this big idea doesn't limit us to just the past or a single group of people. It's intentionally broad so we can include present-day tribal communities, including Navajo, Ute, and Apache, as well as park visitors and park staff, including natural and cultural resource specialists and others. So the new exhibits will clearly communicate that diverse Native communities are still here and have ongoing ties to Mesa Verde. When visitors first enter the museum, they'll be greeted with a message of welcome from Pueblos and tribes, possibly audio in different Native languages. Introductory exhibits will include a pairing of modern cultural item with an ancestral item from Mesa Verde's collection to highlight that cultural continuity that exists between Mesa Verde and today's Pueblos and tribes. This diagram illustrates the planned foundations for the new exhibits. In the center, it says, "We are still here," surrounded by people in relationship with the landscape and multiple ways of knowing, meaning the exhibits will incorporate oral tradition, Native and Western science, and archaeology to provide a richer and more complete understanding of the park and its significance. The outside circle is Mesa Verde's landscape, and the petals are topics that will be woven through the exhibits: family and community, reverence and respect, seasonality and lifeways, and movement and migration. At the start of an exhibit process, we also consider what we want visitors to get out of the experience of visiting. These goals from the Native Interpretation Working Group do a good job of summarizing our priorities for the project. We want people to feel enlightened, feel educated in a way that amazes them and awakens new ways of seeing the world, and learn that we are still here, and what they think of as ruins or monuments to the past are our ancestral sites and places which we continue to return today. They were not abandoned. We also want people to feel and demonstrate respect while in this place. Through the exhibits, we want to model and affect how people use language and behave in the park and beyond. Excuse me. We also want visitors, Native and non-Native, to feel welcomed and respected. These are our core values for our communities. We see this place as alive, a place where our ancestors are, and a place we return to for ceremony through visiting, songs, and prayers. The exhibit designers developed the idea of rooted in the landscape as a framework to organize exhibit content in the museum. We're still in an early phase of the design, but we envision that the galleries will take you through the different park landforms, mesa tops, alcoves, cliffs, and canyons, using a combination of murals and tactile and AV elements to create a sense of immersion in the landscape. Along with the different landscape features, each gallery will focus on a different season. Visitors will start by exploring the mesa tops in summer. This gallery will focus on how people found sustenance here through agriculture and hunting and gathering. It will also explain that the mesa tops were where most people lived. In order to make the museum fully accessible, the next gallery is mostly taken up with a ramp. So we have dubbed this the movement room, and it will explore how people move between the mesa tops and the alcoves, and include images of things such as hand and toe hold trails and cultural items like footwear and items used to carry things from place to place. As you leave the movement room, you will enter the alcoves and cliffs gallery, and the designers envision an experience of coming out from an alcove. This gallery will focus on homes and activities that people engaged in the fall to prepare for winter. And while archaeology will be woven throughout the exhibits as one of the ways we learn about and understand this place, this gallery will include an exhibit about how cliff dwellings and the well-preserved cultural items within them drew early archaeologists to this place and ultimately led to the creation of the park and the passage of the Antiquities Act. The next small gallery is the winter room, a reconstruction of the dwelling as it might have been when it was occupied. This will be an opportunity to learn how people lived in the winter months and explore oral traditions and storytelling. And the last large gallery is devoted to canyons in springtime and will focus on the ideas of movement and migration, including trade and the exchange of ideas. The exhibit experience will culminate by bringing together diverse perspectives of people with close ties to Mesa Verde, and includes opportunities for visitors to consider their own connections to this place and how their experiences at Mesa Verde may have impacted them. It will also focus on encouraging people to visit with respect and encourage visits to present-day tribal communities as appropriate. Display of cultural items will still be an important part of the museum, but the items will be displayed in context so that they help tell the story of people's relationship to the landscape rather than simply showcasing the items themselves. For example, the winter room might display turkey feather socks that would have been worn in winter, and the alcove gallery might display oyas used to collect water by a mural or a model of a seep spring. And the new cases will meet current curatorial standards and allow curators to more easily access and rotate items for better preservation. The new film, sorry about that, not sure what I did here. There we go. The new film will continue to be shown in the museum auditorium. The auditorium also displays large paintings from the Santa Fe Indian School. The film highlights cultural continuity in architecture and pottery, and by doing more to interpret the existing paintings and possibly displaying some contemporary native artwork here as well, we can use art as yet another way to highlight the connections between Mesa Verde and the contemporary Pueblos and tribes. In the film, we were limited to 2 on-camera speakers, but in the museum, we want to include a wider array of voices and do our best to represent all 26 Pueblos and tribes. We will be working with a variety of subject matter experts to speak about different topics. For example, in the Mesa Tops Gallery, we could have direct quotes or audio or video of an Indigenous farmer talking about agricultural techniques that continue to this day. These perspectives will help visitors understand how the relationship with Mesa Verde's landscape helps shape ongoing cultural practices. Signage outside the museum and in the visitor contact area will talk about the museum's history and architecture, and the orientation area will highlight the historic features of the building. That's just a brief overview of where we are in the planning process. In the next design phase, we'll more fully develop these ideas, identify specific stories, start to collect cultural items, and develop interactive elements, and start drafting exhibit text. It'll take another year or so to complete these plans, and the fabrication and installation is only partially funded at this point, so we will be looking for additional fundraising and grant opportunities so that we're ready to start constructing the new exhibits once the plans are complete. We hope to begin installing the new exhibits in the fall of 2025.
So in conclusion, national parks were created to tell America's stories and to represent our country's cultural and natural heritage. It's a proud history of preserving the best of who we are as a people, our diverse experiences, and create a dialogue about events in history and today that might be hard to talk about. National park sites say a lot about who we are as a people and what we value. We are certainly honored by the many awards and attention that the film is receiving, but the greatest satisfaction and most meaningful success is that our tribal members feel heard, seen, and represented in the story of Mesa Verde National Park. Inclusion is a winning solution for everyone. Our interns feel more connected to their ancestral homes. Our visitors gain more insight and a deeper connection by hearing from multiple perspectives, including Western and Native science and traditional knowledge. And the sacred landscape that we as park stewards are here to preserve and protect is better cared for and cared about for future generations. So to learn more about the park or to plan a visit, please visit our website. And also to support the park and inclusion efforts and many other meaningful projects, please visit the Mesa Verde Foundation website, and the QR codes are listed here.
Wow. I think everyone will agree that this was a wonderful presentation and that you covered many important projects and perspectives. I personally love that you are moving at the speed of trust to include so many perspectives. Now is the time to wrap up this month's webinar. I would like to take the time to thank Kristy and Amy for a wonderful presentation. Thank you both so very much. And Mesa Verde's Superintendent, Casey Cook-Collins, for her support of our webinar series. And of course, I want to thank all of you for joining us to learn more about the park's important work to create and share more inclusive storytelling. I hope that you all enjoyed this presentation and that you have a wonderful evening.